$21.7 billion. That is what ExxonMobil is now prepared to spend chasing oil off the coast of a Caribbean island most people only know for carnival and steel pan music. $21.7 billion in a country whose entire economy is worth roughly $28 billion. Think about that ratio for a second. This is not a company dipping a toe into a small market. This is the most successful deep-water operator on the planet, placing a bet that is nearly the size of Trinidad and Tobago's entire national output on a stretch of ocean floor nobody has ever drilled before. And it is not just Exxon. In the space of 18 months, a Houston company has hit oil where geologists swore only gas would ever be found. A British supermajor has flipped the switch on a brand new offshore platform. The government has thrown open the largest exploration bidding round in the country's history. And a nation that watched its oil industry collapse for 30 straight years is suddenly being talked about, quietly, carefully, by people inside the energy industry as the most interesting frontier play left in the Western Hemisphere. Here is the question we are going to answer today. Is this real? Is Trinidad actually on the verge of a second oil age, one that could rival what happened next door in Guyana? Or is this another chapter in a long Caribbean story of promises that get made and never get kept? By the time this is over, you will know exactly where the money is going, exactly why it is going there right now, and exactly what it means for the millions of people across this region whose lives are tied to what happens in these waters. Some of what you are about to hear will genuinely surprise you. If this is the kind of story you want more of, the kind that skips the headlines and gets into the why, do one thing for me before we go further. Hit subscribe. This channel is small right now. We are building toward 10,000 subscribers, and every single one of you who joins makes a real difference in whether stories like this keep getting told properly. Thank you. Now let's get into it. To understand why 2025 and 2026 matter so much, you need to go back much further than you'd expect. Because Trinidad's relationship with oil did not start with Exxon, and it did not start with Guyana's boom next door, making everyone suddenly pay attention to the region. It started in 1866 in a swamp. A retired American Civil War captain named Walter Darwin had convinced a small group of merchants in Port of Spain to fund an idea most of them privately thought was madness. He wanted to drill for oil in the mud of southern Trinidad on an estate called Ariparo. His first attempt, near San Fernando, produced nothing but a dry hole and mounting debt. He moved his crude wooden rig, tried again, and this time, at a depth of 160 feet, something came up out of the ground that would define this country for the next century and a half. Oil. Real, dark, unmistakable crude, bubbling out of Caribbean earth 7 years after the first commercial oil well in Pennsylvania, and 3 full years before John D. Rockefeller had even incorporated Standard Oil. Let that sink in. Trinidad was producing oil before the company that would come to dominate the entire global industry even existed on paper. This is one of the oldest oil-producing territories anywhere on the planet, and almost nobody outside the region knows it. Commercial production began in earnest in 1908, when a well at Point Fortin started producing in serious volume. From there, oil became the backbone of everything. Refineries went up along the coast. Pipelines were laid across the south. Companies with names like Trinidad Leaseholds, Texaco, and Amoco moved in and built entire towns around their operations. Towns where the school, the clinic, and the grocery store all existed because of the oil company down the road. During the Second World War, Trinidad's refineries became strategically vital to the Allied war effort, processing fuel that helped keep ships and aircraft moving across the Atlantic. That wartime importance cemented oil even deeper into the national identity. And a workforce was built, generation by generation, fathers teaching sons how to read a reservoir, how to run a rig, how to refine crude into something the world would pay for. Entire communities in the south of the island organized their lives around shift schedules at the refinery gates. By the late 1970s, at the industry's absolute peak, Trinidad was producing close to 230,000 barrels of oil a day. For a twin island nation with barely over 1 million people at the time, that is an almost unbelievable number. The money transformed the country. Trinidad became the wealthiest English-speaking nation in the Caribbean, not through tourism, not through agriculture, but through what was sitting beneath its own soil and seabed. But oil fields are not bank accounts. You cannot keep withdrawing from them forever without consequence. And this is the part of the story that most people skip straight past. The part that actually explains why what's happening right now feels so significant. Because after that 1970s peak, the fields began to age. The easy oil got extracted. Reservoir pressure dropped well by well, year by year. And over 3 long, painful decades, Trinidad's daily output slid from 230,000 barrels all the way down to roughly 50,000 barrels a day by 2023. That is a collapse of nearly 80%. Try to sit with what that actually meant for real people. This was not an abstract economic statistic. This was a country whose schools, whose hospitals, whose roads, whose entire sense of national identity had been built on petroleum revenue, watching that revenue quietly erode with no clear plan to stop it. Young engineers who had trained specifically to work in Trinidad's oil fields started leaving for Alberta, for the Gulf states, for anywhere on Earth that still had work for people with their exact skill set. Families that had been in the energy business for 3 generations suddenly had children who saw absolutely no future in staying. Towns in the south of the island that had once thrived around refinery shift schedules began to empty out. Service companies that had supplied drilling equipment for decades started laying off crews. Import and export volumes at the ports tied to the energy sector shrank year after year, and every one of those numbers represented a family somewhere deciding whether to stay or go. If you are watching this from Toronto, from Houston, from London, and your own family has roots in Trinidad's energy sector, you already know this story. You may have lived it. You may be the reason a house back home sits with an empty room upstairs, because the person who used to sleep in it is now working a rig somewhere in Alberta and sending money home instead. The gas side of the business followed the same brutal trajectory. Trinidad was once the largest supplier of liquefied natural gas to the entire United States. The Atlantic LNG facility at Point Fortin, with 4 massive processing trains capable of handling around 15 million tons of gas a year, was one of the single most important energy installations anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. But by 2020, gas supplies had dropped so severely that Train 1 had to be shut down entirely. By March of 2025, BP confirmed it would be permanently decommissioned. An entire liquefaction train, representing billions of dollars in sunk infrastructure, mothballed because there simply was not enough gas left to feed it. Between 2015 and 2024, gas production fell 33%, from 4.3 billion cubic feet a day down to just 2.5 billion. Trinidad was not just declining. It was staring down the barrel of a moment where its most valuable infrastructure became permanently stranded. That is, the Trinidad that existed right up until the middle of this decade. A proud, historic energy nation watching its own foundation crumble in slow motion. And then in the space of about 18 months, everything started to change. Mark this date, May 1st, 2025. A Houston-based company called EOG Resources released its first quarter earnings. Buried inside the financial data was a single line that made energy analysts across the entire Caribbean sit up straight in their chairs. EOG had made a shallow water oil discovery off Trinidad's east coast. The well was called Beryl, drilled in an area known as TSP Deep, in about 170 feet of water. It hit more than 125 feet of what geologists call net pay, high-quality oil-bearing rock. Here is why that number should stop you in your tracks. This was an area of the seabed that had been mapped, studied, and written off for decades as gas territory, not oil territory. Generations of geologists working these waters believed they understood exactly what was down there and exactly what was not. EOG drilled through it anyway and found over 100 feet of premium crude reservoir, sitting in shallow water, where development costs are a fraction of what deep water drilling requires. In an industry where a single deep water well can cost well over $100 million to drill, a shallow water discovery like Beryl can move from confirmed find to producing barrels in a fraction of the time and at a fraction of the cost. This is the kind of discovery that makes an oil company move fast, because every month of delay is a month of value left on the table. EOG immediately partnered with BP Trinidad and Tobago in 50-50 joint venture and began pushing Beryl toward a final investment decision almost right away. A level of urgency that told the rest of the industry this was not a marginal find being quietly shelved. That would have been a big enough story on its own. But it was not alone. Just weeks later, on May 29, 2025, a second EOG and BP joint venture called Mento achieved first gas from a brand new 12-slot platform off Trinidad's southeast coast. Mento is one of only 10 major projects BP has planned to bring online globally between 2025 and 2027, and its peak production is projected to hit 8,200 barrels a day. Right behind it sits the Coconut Field, another joint development expected to add another 3,000 barrels a day by 2027. Then there's Perenco, the French independent operator, running re-drill workovers on the Puy field, expected to add another 2,900 barrels a day in early 2026. And Heritage Petroleum, the state-owned company, has its own East Soldado field development underway, targeting another 2,000 barrels a day. None of those individual numbers, on their own, would move the global oil market even slightly. A few thousand barrels a day here, a few thousand there, means nothing to a world that consumes over 100 million barrels daily. But this story was never about Trinidad competing on the global stage barrel for barrel. It is about a country stopping a 30-year bleed and turning it into a slow, deliberate climb. Each of these projects also means something very specific on the ground. A field like East Soldado coming back online means Heritage Petroleum, the state company, keeps skilled local crews employed instead of laying them off. A workover program like Perenco's on the Puy field means existing wells that were written off as marginal get a second life instead of being plugged and abandoned. These are not glamorous headline numbers, but they are the difference between a service company keeping its doors open in San Fernando or shutting them for good. Add them together and a pattern starts to emerge that is impossible to ignore. Trinidad is not sitting still hoping for a miracle. It is clawing its way back project by project, well by well. And the biggest play in this entire story had not even started yet. In August of 2025, the government of Trinidad and Tobago did something that sent an actual shockwave through Caribbean energy circles. They awarded ExxonMobil a massive ultra-deepwater block called TTDU-1 sitting off the country's east coast. 7 separate blocks were consolidated into one single enormous exploration area. The final size, over 7,165 square kilometers, is physically larger than the entire landmass of Trinidad and Tobago itself. And ExxonMobil secured 100% working interest, no partners, no shared risk. Exxon wanted total control of this block, and Trinidad gave it to them. Why would Exxon want that kind of exposure on a single bet? The answer sits just to the northwest, in waters most of you have already heard of. TTDU-1 borders the Stabroek Block offshore Guyana, where Exxon and its partners have confirmed more than 11 billion barrels of recoverable oil. Guyana's production hit 914,000 barrels a day in the first quarter of 2026 alone, and is on track to break 1 million barrels a day before this year is out. A country that had virtually zero oil production just 7 years ago is now the second largest crude producer in South America, ahead of Venezuela. That happened because of Exxon, and now Exxon is taking everything it learned building that success, every geological model, every deepwater technique, every subsurface mapping breakthrough, and pointing it directly at Trinidad. Exxon's own Vice President of Global Exploration described the geological setting of TTDU-1 as mirroring conditions found in other major deepwater discoveries around the world. He called it a vast frontier block and said the company was genuinely excited about its prospects. Trinidad's energy minister went further, stating publicly that if ExxonMobil finds commercial reserves in this block, total investment could reach that $21.7 billion figure. For a country with a national economy of roughly $28 billion, that is almost the size of the entire economy tied up in a single exploration project. The pace of this deal is almost as remarkable as its size. Exxon first approached Trinidad about this block in November 2024. The production sharing contract was signed by August 2025. In an industry where deals of this scale typically take years to negotiate, that timeline is almost unheard of. Both sides clearly understood that a window was open, and neither wanted to risk it closing. The first phase alone requires $42.5 million just for a three-dimensional seismic survey covering thousands of square kilometers of ocean floor. By December 2025, Trinidad's Environmental Management Authority had already granted clearance for that survey, the first time in the country's history that environmental approval had ever been issued for ultra-deepwater exploration. Drilling itself could begin within 6 months of the survey wrapping up. Now here's where most people, when they hear this story, get the comparison wrong. The instinctive reaction is to stack Trinidad up against Guyana and conclude Trinidad simply cannot compete. And on paper, that reaction makes sense. Guyana went from producing essentially nothing to nearly 1 million barrels a day in under a decade, a growth curve almost without precedent anywhere in the world. Trinidad is producing somewhere between 50 and 70,000 barrels a day right now. Guyana has 11 billion barrels of confirmed recoverable reserves, a number so large it has permanently rewritten how the entire industry thinks about South American exploration. Trinidad's proven reserves sit at roughly 243 million barrels. By those raw numbers alone, they are not even playing the same game, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. If you are looking purely at scale, Guyana has already won this comparison, and it likely will for a long time to come. But that comparison misses something that matters enormously, and it's the thing that could make Trinidad's story move faster than almost anyone expects. Infrastructure. Guyana had to build its entire oil industry from absolutely nothing. Every floating production vessel, every subsea pipeline, every piece of supply chain connection had to be imported, constructed, and staffed largely with foreign expertise from scratch at enormous cost and over years of lead time. Trinidad does not have that problem. Trinidad already has refineries. It already has petrochemical plants. It already has the Phoenix Park Gas Processors Complex, one of the largest natural gas liquids processing facilities in the entire Western Hemisphere, capable of handling close to 2 billion cubic feet of gas a day. It has the Atlantic LNG terminal. It has pipelines already connecting offshore platforms to onshore facilities. It has deepwater ports already built and operating. It has an established legal and regulatory framework for offshore production that has been refined over more than a century of operation instead of being written from scratch under pressure. And most importantly of all, it has a workforce that has been doing this exact job for over a century. 3 generations of engineers, geologists, drillers, and platform operators who understand this specific geology, these specific weather patterns, and this specific regulatory environment in a way that cannot be imported or trained overnight. Think about what that actually saves in practical terms. When Guyana's first offshore production started, floating production vessels had to be built overseas and towed across oceans. Entire crews of foreign specialists had to be flown in and housed because the local workforce simply did not exist yet. None of that applies to Trinidad in the same way. A newly discovered field off Trinidad's coast can potentially tie into existing pipeline infrastructure that already runs to shore, instead of requiring a floating production storage, an offloading vessel built from the ground up. That difference alone can shave years off a project timeline and hundreds of millions of dollars off a development budget. If ExxonMobil or any other operator makes a commercial discovery in Trinidad's deep water, the timeline from discovery to actual production could be dramatically shorter than what Guyana went through, precisely because the hard infrastructure work is already done. This is Trinidad's hidden advantage, and it is one the market has been quietly underpricing for years. We also need to talk about gas, because Trinidad's gas potential might be an even bigger story than its oil story, and it is getting far less attention outside industry circles. The government has stated that total natural gas resources could be as high as 58.25 trillion cubic feet, a figure that, if it holds up under further exploration, would represent decades of future supply. Trinidad already sits as the largest natural gas producer in the entire Caribbean, and has historically been one of the biggest LNG exporters in the Western Hemisphere, at one point supplying a meaningful share of the natural gas imported into the United States. Its downstream industries, methanol, ammonia, urea, iron, and steel, all depend entirely on a steady, affordable supply of natural gas as their core feedstock, not as an optional input. Trinidad has long been one of the world's largest exporters of ammonia and methanol, specifically because cheap, abundant local gas made those industries globally competitive for decades. When gas production declined, those industries suffered directly. Plants ran below capacity, export volumes dropped, revenue shrank across the board. Workers in those downstream plants, not just in the oil and gas fields themselves, felt the squeeze in reduced hours and stalled expansion plans. The entire petrochemical ecosystem that made Trinidad genuinely unique among Caribbean nations began to wobble, threatening not just energy jobs but an entire secondary layer of industrial employment built on top of it. What's happening now is a coordinated push involving multiple major international operators, all moving at once. Shell took a final investment decision on the Manatee gas field in 2024 and followed it with another final investment decision on the Aphrodite field in 2025. Both are designed to feed new gas supply back into the Atlantic LNG facility and the domestic market. BP's Ginger project, a shallow water development tied to existing infrastructure, secured its own final investment decision, with drilling beginning in January 2025 and first gas expected in 2027 at a projected peak of 62,000 barrels of oil equivalent per day. Then there's Calypso, a massive 3.5 trillion cubic foot deep-water gas discovery operated by Woodside Energy, with BP holding a 30% stake. If Calypso reaches its own final investment decision, which was being accelerated toward late 2025 or early 2026, it could deliver first gas by the early 2030s and fundamentally reshape Trinidad's gas supply picture for decades to come. Put all of these projects together, Beryl, Mento, Coconut, Pui, TTDU1, Ginger, Manatee, Aphrodite, Calypso, and you are looking at the most concentrated wave of upstream energy investment Trinidad and Tobago has experienced in a generation. Quite possibly the most concentrated wave it has ever experienced in its entire 160-year oil history. The political timing behind all of this is not an accident either. In April 2025, Trinidad held a general election that returned Kamla Persad-Bissessar to power as Prime Minister. Her administration has made energy revival a stated centerpiece of national policy, with the explicit public goal of making Trinidad and Tobago the energy capital of the Caribbean once again, language that has shown up repeatedly in government statements and budget speeches since. The government launched a deep-water competitive bidding round in February 2025. Offering 266 blocks for exploration, one of the largest such rounds the country has ever conducted at once. Companies including CNOOC, the Chinese state-backed oil giant, submitted bids, a detail worth noting given the broader geopolitical picture already described. The government has also signaled faster regulatory approvals and a review of the oil and gas taxation regime to keep Trinidad competitive on the world stage, recognizing that operators now have real alternatives across Guyana, Suriname, and Brazil, and that Trinidad has to actively compete for capital rather than assume it will arrive automatically because of its history. Trinidad's energy minister has publicly stated that oil production is projected to increase between 2025 and 2028 based on the current project pipeline, while also acknowledging the need to reverse Heritage Petroleum's declining offshore output, which fell from over 21,000 barrels a day in 2015 to about 17,000 in 2025. So let's be completely honest with you, because that's what this channel is actually for. Is this the biggest oil discovery, in the absolute global sense, bigger than anything the world has ever seen? No, not even close, and anyone telling you otherwise is selling you something. The world has seen discoveries like the Ghawar field in Saudi Arabia, still the largest conventional oil field ever found, the pre-salt formations off Brazil that reshaped South American production for a generation, and the Stabroek Block itself right next door in Guyana, all of which dwarf anything currently confirmed in Trinidad by orders of magnitude. If you came here expecting a claim that Trinidad just out-discovered Saudi Arabia, that is not the honest version of this story. And we are not in the business of telling you the dishonest version just to earn a few extra minutes of watch time. But here is the argument for why this moment may genuinely be the biggest in Trinidad's own history, and one of the most consequential energy developments happening anywhere in the Caribbean right now. What is unfolding here is not a single discovery. It is a convergence, and convergences like this are rare in the energy industry, precisely because they require so many separate pieces to line up at once. Favorable geology, willing capital, existing infrastructure, and political will, all arriving in the same narrow window of time. Multiple discoveries, multiple international operators, multiple simultaneous commitments of capital, all arriving at the same time in a country that already has the infrastructure in place to monetize them quickly, instead of building it from nothing over a decade. Consider what each piece contributes on its own. The Beryl find proved the geology still holds real surprises even in areas geologists thought they understood completely. The ExxonMobil deal brought the single most successful deepwater operator on Earth back into waters it had walked away from 20 years earlier, carrying with it the exact playbook that turned Guyana into a global energy story in under a decade. The gas projects, spread across Shell, BP, and Woodside, are securing the exact feedstock that keeps Trinidad's entire downstream industrial complex alive, from methanol plants to steel production. And a newly elected government is actively working to clear the regulatory path for all of it, moving faster on approvals than Trinidad's bureaucracy has moved in decades. That combination is rare. Executed correctly, it does not just add a few barrels to a production chart somewhere. It reshapes a national economy for an entire generation, the same way a single decade of decisions in the 1970s shaped Trinidad's fortunes for the 50 years that followed. Now let's zoom out, because this was never just a Trinidad story, it is a Caribbean story. Most islands in this region have tiny or non-existent commercial oil production. Barbados has some exploration underway. Cuba has small-scale output. Jamaica is evaluating its own offshore potential, but nothing close to what Trinidad already possesses in terms of proven geology, existing infrastructure, and active investment from major international players. The only real comparison anywhere in the region is Guyana, and Guyana's entire model required building everything from absolute zero. Trinidad's model is about reviving and expanding what already exists. That is a fundamentally different situation, and in a lot of ways, a more resilient one. There is also a geopolitical dimension to this that almost nobody outside the industry ever discusses publicly. The Caribbean sits directly at the crossroads of the Western Hemisphere's most critical shipping lanes, close to the Panama Canal approaches and directly along routes that matter enormously to both North and South American trade. Energy security in this region has become a growing strategic priority for the United States, particularly with continuing tensions surrounding Venezuela, a country that sits just a few miles across the water from Trinidad and holds some of the largest oil reserves on the planet, largely locked away from Western investment for years. China's expanding economic footprint through Belt and Road-style investment across Latin America and the Caribbean adds another layer to this picture, as Beijing has been steadily building port, infrastructure, and resource relationships across the region. Against that backdrop, a stable, democratic Caribbean nation with a genuinely robust energy export sector is exactly the kind of partner major Western economies want to support right now, both economically and strategically. That helps explain why ExxonMobil moved with such unusual speed on TTDU-1, and why the deal came together in under a year when similar negotiations elsewhere have dragged on for half a decade. Both sides understood there was a window, shaped as much by geopolitics as by geology, and neither wanted to be the one who let it close. But let's bring this all the way back down to ground level, because the human story is what actually makes any of this matter. Trinidad and Tobago has a population of about 1.5 million people. The energy sector there is not some abstract line item in an economics textbook, it is livelihoods. It is whether a young person can study engineering at the University of the West Indies and actually find a job at home after graduation instead of packing a suitcase for Fort McMurray or Houston. It is whether the government has enough revenue to maintain roads, fund healthcare, and keep social programs running. When oil and gas revenue declines, the effects ripple through every part of daily life. Higher taxes, pressure on the currency, cuts to public spending, and a slow, corrosive sense that the best opportunities are always somewhere else. If you are a Trinidadian in Toronto right now, this is not a distant headline to you. This is the reason half your family tree lives outside the country. This is why your parents left, why your cousins are scattered between Alberta and Houston and London, why every family gathering eventually turns into a conversation about who's still home and who's thinking about leaving. A revival in Trinidad's energy sector is not an abstract macroeconomic event for you. It is the difference between your younger cousin finishing an engineering degree at UWI and boarding a plane out, or finishing that same degree and walking straight into a job on a platform an hour offshore from where your grandmother still lives. It is the difference between sending money home every month indefinitely, or watching that flow of money eventually reverse, as opportunity starts moving back toward the island instead of away from it. If you are a Guyanese in New York watching your own country's oil boom reshape everything back home, you already understand exactly what this kind of investment wave can do to a small nation in a short amount of time, for better and for worse. You have watched remittance patterns shift, watched cousins who once seemed permanently settled abroad start quietly asking about opportunities back home, Watch the exchange rate and the cost of a plane ticket back become genuinely different conversations than they were 10 years ago. Trinidad is now standing at the very beginning of that same curve, and if you have lived through Guyana's version of this story, you know exactly how fast the ground can shift once the capital starts flowing. And if you are a Jamaican in London who has never thought about Trinidad's oil industry for a single second in your life, here is why it should still matter to you. A stronger, wealthier Trinidad means a stronger regional economy, more intra-Caribbean trade, more capital available for regional investment funds and CARICOM initiatives, more remittance and travel capacity flowing between islands, and a louder Caribbean voice in rooms where decisions about this entire region get made without us in them. When one Caribbean nation gets a real seat at the global energy table, it changes the leverage of every nation sitting near it. Jamaica's own tourism and logistics sectors do not exist in isolation from the rest of the region's economic health. A rising tide in Port of Spain has a way of eventually reaching Kingston, Bridgetown, and Georgetown too, even if the connection is not always obvious from the outside. Every new well that comes online, every seismic survey that begins, every investment dollar that flows in, represents a genuine chance to reverse the brain drain that has hollowed out Trinidad's energy workforce for 2 decades. Local contractors are already gearing up. Service companies that scaled down during the lean years are cautiously expanding again. The energy sector represents roughly a third of the government's total revenue and a dominant share of the country's exports. When it moves, the entire country moves with it. Of course, none of this is guaranteed. Nothing in deepwater exploration ever is. ExxonMobil could spend hundreds of millions of dollars on seismic surveys and exploratory wells in TTDU-1 and come up with nothing commercially viable. The geology looks promising, but frontier exploration means drilling in places nobody has ever drilled before, and the ocean does not care how much money you've committed. Environmental concerns here are legitimate, not theoretical. Trinidad sits directly in the hurricane belt, and its marine ecosystems are genuinely fragile. Any large-scale drilling program has to balance economic ambition with real environmental responsibility, and that balance is never guaranteed to be struck correctly. There is also the resource curse to consider, the well-documented pattern where countries that become dependent on natural resource revenue end up with more corruption, more inequality, and more volatility instead of broad-based prosperity. You can see versions of this pattern play out across the world. In petrostates, where a wave of new oil wealth enriched a small connected class, while the majority of citizens saw little lasting benefit, and where currency and public spending became dangerously tied to the price of a single commodity. Trinidad has experienced elements of this before, during its 1970s boom years, when oil wealth flowed in fast and a share of it was lost to mismanagement and projects that never delivered lasting value. Managing a potential new wave of wealth wisely, keeping the process transparent, fighting corruption at every level, diversifying the economy so it is not entirely hostage to oil prices again, and making sure the benefits actually reach everyday citizens rather than a narrow elite. That will be the real test of this entire era, far more than any single well result. History does not automatically repeat itself, but it does not automatically avoid repeating itself either. That part depends entirely on choices being made in Port of Spain right now. And then there is the global energy transition itself. The world is moving, gradually, toward renewables, electric vehicles, and lower carbon energy systems. Oil demand is not disappearing overnight, not for petrochemicals, not for aviation fuel, not for shipping, and not for the reliable baseload power that developing nations still need to grow. But the window for new oil developments to generate their maximum possible value is not infinite either. Trinidad's leaders clearly understand this. It is a large part of why this push is happening right now, rather than a decade from now. The stated strategy is to use oil and gas revenue as a bridge, funding a more diversified economy, while these resources still command strong global prices. So where does all of this actually leave us? Let me lay out 3 honest paths forward, because I am not interested in giving you a fairy tale ending or a doom and gloom one just for the sake of drama. The optimistic path looks like this. Multiple new fields come online between now and 2030. ExxonMobil makes a genuine commercial discovery in TTDU-1 that validates the entire deepwater thesis, and a second phase of exploration follows almost immediately behind it. gas projects like Ginger, Calypso, and Manatee ramp up and restore full supply to the Atlantic LNG facility and its downstream industries, bringing the mothballed liquefaction train question back to life instead of leaving it permanently shut. Oil production climbs back toward 100,000 barrels a day or beyond. Foreign investment accelerates further, drawing in service companies and contractors that had left the country entirely during the lean years. Government revenues stabilize and grow, easing pressure on the currency and on public spending. Young engineers who left for Alberta and the Gulf start seriously entertaining offers to come home. Trinidad reestablishes itself as the undisputed energy capital of the Caribbean, with Guyana standing beside it as a regional partner rather than a rival. The realistic path looks like this. Progress is steady but incremental, not explosive. Some wells succeed. Others disappoint because that is simply how exploration works, and TTDU-1 in particular remains a genuine coin flip until real wells go into the ground. Oil production adds meaningful barrels between 2028 and 2030, but does not reach the 1970s peak. Gas supply improves, but does not fully resolve the shortfall the country has been living with. The economy benefits noticeably, unemployment in the energy sector eases, and government revenue improves, but nothing transforms overnight and the brain drain slows rather than reverses outright. Trinidad remains the Caribbean's most developed energy player, but shares the regional spotlight with Guyana rather than reclaiming it outright. And the pessimistic path looks like this. Deepwater exploration hits dry holes in TTDU-1 and Exxon's enormous bet does not pay off the way Guyana's did. Costs run over budget across multiple projects simultaneously. Political disputes slow down regulatory approvals at exactly the wrong moment, or a change in government shifts energy policy priorities. Hurricanes disrupt platform operations during a critical drilling season, costing months of lost time. Global oil prices weaken and investment appetite across the entire industry cools, making Trinidad a lower priority on every operator's list. The entire wave of momentum stalls out before it ever reaches critical mass. Remittances from abroad remain the primary lifeline for tuna families, and Trinidad remains stuck in the slow, painful decline it has been living through for 2 decades. Right now, in the middle of 2026, the honest read of the evidence puts us somewhere between the optimistic and realistic paths, closer to the optimistic end than most people outside the industry realize. The deals are signed. The capital is committed. The seismic surveys are already underway. First gas has already been achieved at Mento. Multiple development projects are actively advancing toward production, not just sitting on paper. And the most successful deepwater operator in the entire Western Hemisphere has staked its reputation, and potentially billions of real dollars, on Trinidad's untapped ultra-deepwater geology. Want to hear directly from you on this one. If you are from Trinidad, if you have family from Trinidad, if you are anywhere across this Caribbean diaspora, or if you simply follow energy markets and care about small nations fighting to control their own economic destiny, put it in the comments. Do you believe this is genuinely Trinidad's moment? Or have you heard this exact kind of promise before and watched it quietly fade away? If you have family back home in the energy sector, has any of this actually changed anything for them yet? Or does it still feel like headlines that haven't reached the ground? And honestly, what does Trinidad need to get right this time to make sure this wave of investment turns into a better life for ordinary people, and not just a better balance sheet for foreign oil companies? I read every comment on this channel personally, and I will respond to as many of you as I possibly can. 160 years ago, a retired soldier stood in the mud outside a small estate called Aripero and pulled crude oil out of the ground with a hand-operated wooden rig, funded by a handful of merchants who half expected to lose every dollar they put in. Today, that exact same earth, that exact same seabed, those exact same geological formations that he barely scratched the surface of, are being mapped by 3-dimensional seismic vessels and targeted by companies with the technology to drill miles beneath the ocean floor, backed by billions of dollars from some of the largest corporations on the planet. The tools have changed almost beyond recognition. The stakes for the people living on that same soil have not changed nearly as much. The story of Trinidad and oil is one of the oldest energy stories anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, older than Standard Oil itself. And right now, in the middle of a decade defined by energy transition and geopolitical uncertainty everywhere else in the world, it genuinely feels like the next chapter of this particular story might turn out to be the most important one yet. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, you are exactly the kind of viewer who makes a channel like this worth building. Hit that like button if you learned something you didn't know before today. Share this with someone in your life who needs to hear this story. A parent, a cousin, anyone with roots in this region. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is genuinely the time. We are a small channel with big ambitions. We are chasing 10,000 subscribers, and we have a lot more of these stories still to uncover. Take care, stay curious, and I will see you in the next one.